We're two young adults seeing the effect of climate change unfold. Coming from a small village in Hertfordshire, we became interested in what our local farmers are doing to create a more sustainable farming future. Seeing the passion they have for this change, we want to share the work they're implementing in hopes to inspire this work across the nation.
So the cover crops fit into the farmer's rotational cycle. This is kind of the different crops the farmer would grow throughout the year or throughout subsequent years. Essentially, what the cover crops are doing are kind of filling a gap that often exists in a farmer's rotation. So most crops in this part of the world are harvested in late summer, July, August, September time, and then often there can be a gap of maybe 4 or 5 months until the farmer plants his next crop, which might be a spring crop. So where the cover crops fit in nicely is when you have that gap where you'd have bare soil throughout the winter. That's when it's quite a high risk period for nitrate leaching, but also having bare soil can have, if that field is next to a water course, next to a river, then you might get soil loss into the river. So actually covering that land at that time of year with a growing crop is really good at stabilising the soil, holding onto the nitrate, and it can also provide some of the other benefits, such as biodiversity gains and things like that. So the farmer would plant the cover crop as soon as possible once they've harvested their cash crop. I mean, there's a whole range of cover crop species that you can grow, list as long as my arm, but the sorts of species that are good for nitrate capture are things like oil radish, any brassicas, things like turnip rape, mustards, but then there are other species, oats, there's Phacelia, sunflowers. If you're growing a sort of a late summer cover crop, then there's certain species like sunflowers which great for the soil, but also brilliant for biodiversity, and just seeing a field of sunflowers just kind of gladdens the
Yes.
the heart. So the cover crops are excellent at holding on to any excess nitrate that might be in the soil. Even with the best farming system in the world, with the best nutrient management, there will still be some nitrate, residual nitrate, left in the field after harvest. So this is where the cover crops come in. So the farmer will plant a cover crop, and these cover crops are fast-growing plants. The farmer isn't harvesting these cover crops. It's purely being grown as a sort of, if you're a gardener, it's a bit like a green manure, something that you're growing to build soil fertility. But these cover crops capture the nitrate, and they reduce that nitrate from actually being lost into the water. So it's solving the problem at source rather than solving it as sort of an end-of-pipe solution, we call it, which costs time, energy, so it's a much more sustainable solution. And the great thing about cover crops is that they don't just capture nitrate, they provide a whole range of other benefits. They build soil health, they aid infiltration, they can stop soil erosion, which can impact local rivers and streams, and it's good for the farmer as well. It's building the soil organic matter. And if you allow the cover crops to grow on for longer, they can flower, and they can provide benefits to pollinators, things like bees and butterflies. So we can kind of split it between, you can call it green infrastructure or grey infrastructure. Grey infrastructure is where you're building things with concrete, end-of-pipe solutions. Green infrastructure is actually thinking about how we can solve some of these problems by working with kind of nature-based solutions is another good term. And the great thing about those is they just have multiple benefits. These cover crops capture carbon as well, which is another really important element when thinking about climate change mitigations.
One of the fundamental things that a cover crop does is literally cover the ground. So the first thing that does is it protects the soil surface from the impact of weather, from UV lights, which is quite damaging to soil biology, but also with the rainfall that we're now having, it tends to seem to come in more severe bouts. We get shorter, heavier bursts of rain, and that percussive force of rainfall hitting bare ground is quite damaging, and it starts to move the really valuable topsoil, and that's when we start to lose it from the field. So if you've got a cover crop over the surface of the soil, it protects that surface and slows that rate of attrition down, and then the roots obviously penetrating and allowing the water to infiltrate as well. So there's a number of physical properties, but also we're starting now to understand more about the biological and chemical activity that's going on. And I think it would be fair to say in the last probably 40 years we've understood the physics and perhaps maybe the chemistry of the soil quite well, but we've neglected the biology, and the biology is a really, really important part as we go forward. I think we've got a lot to learn about how we can use that to help us and be less perhaps damaging to the soil than we have been in the past.
And ideally, the good thing about a cover crop, what you're doing is you're holding on to the nutrients in the soil, and then ideally you're passing those nutrients on to the next crop, which means it's creating a bit more of a circular system, and it's reducing the amount of then inorganic fertilizer that the farmer may have to use on their next crop. And obviously inorganic fertilizer is quite an energy intensive process to producing inorganic fertilizer. So relying on the kind of organic cycling of nutrients is more sustainable in the long run. But it is about seeing if we can create a more ecologically balanced farming system. Some people could use the term agroecology, where like regenerative agriculture. It is just trying to think more, incorporate more of those natural cycles into farming, I think.
But I think cover crops have a real role to play because they can fit into existing systems of farming without disrupting them very much, and we can really use them well, get the benefits from them, but they're not causing massive disruption to existing systems. Cover crops, I think, are a relatively low-cost thing to do with a potentially massive benefit. And are there some issues? Yes, definitely. We found here at this trial farm, we've made some big mistakes that have cost 2 tons of yield compared to what we would have done traditionally. But it wasn't because cover crops will always do that, it's because we got it wrong. And we know we got it wrong, we know what we did wrong, and we won't do that again. So, there are issues, but with more experience and more learning, we'll get past those and retain the benefits and minimise the problems.
We've been working with farmers now for about 5 years in this area. Firstly, to study cover crops, we have various trials that we've set up on farms in the area, where we've been studying the impact of cover crops on things like soil health, water quality, biodiversity, and we used that as evidence to then kind of make the business case that this is actually something that we can invest in as a company. So the last couple of years we've been running a funding scheme where we have a pot of money that farmers can apply basically for some money to help them grow cover crops, and we've been doing that for a couple of years in this area around North Hertfordshire, which is a sort of an area where we have a number of groundwater sources that will benefit from growing cover crops. So yeah, it's something that we've been doing for a few years, and I think it's going to become part of our longer term plans to continue working with farmers.
And subsidies are paid to farmers to encourage them to behave in a particular way. So back in the 70s, what was being encouraged was production, because the government wanted to make sure that we had plenty of food. So the subsidy then was paid basically on every tonne that was produced. So farmers were then encouraged to produce as many tonnes as they could, and they got more subsidy. But that led to butter mountains, grain mountains, wine lakes, all that sort of thing. So then they realised that actually encouraging production wasn't the way to go, but they still wanted to subsidise people, so they subsidised it on the area, so that the area that you grew the subsidy was fixed, and it didn't matter how many tonnes you produced on that area. It didn't affect how much you got paid. Everyone got paid the same. But that then led to perhaps all the fields being ploughed up to every corner and under every hedge and into every piece of the field, and a lot of land that perhaps would have been left for wildlife got converted into farmland, because that's what the subsidy drove people to do. And people have realised obviously that had consequences, and so now those sorts of subsidies are now finished, and there's a thing called the basic payment scheme, and that's being wound down and going to be finished in a few years' time. And then the payments to farmers will almost entirely be based on public goods, so environmental features, so clean air, clean water and so on, as well as biodiversity. So that's how the pattern of subsidies has changed over the years, and as I said before, all farmers have done is followed what government and other people have said was what they wanted to be done and what was considered to be best practice at the time. They get a lot of blame for that, but perhaps we should look at why they did it, not just what they did, to really get the full picture.
Yeah, there's got to be some drive to want to protect the environment, make things more sustainable in how we deliver the key aspects for society, things like supplying drinking water, providing food. These are really key issues. So actually, a passion to want to make these things slightly better, I think, is important. But also, there's a clear business need to doing catchment management. I mean, I think certainly a business like a water company, we've got to think long term and sort of managing catchments, working with people like farmers and other land managers in catchments to ensure that things are sustainable in the long run is really important. And I think that does make business sense, but it also makes sense for the environment and sustainability.
I just want people to educate themselves. A lot of people get their information from Twitter and things like that, and it's just too narrow a focus. You need to really read some books, go to some talks, try some stuff on your own farm in a small way. Make it a meaningful size, but do it in a small way so that you're not going to get yourself into too much bother. But give it a go, and we've found that people who are doing it well and taking a real interest, every year they're doing more because they're seeing for themselves the benefits that it brings. It isn't a 5-minute wonder. It'll take a while to really start delivering. But we've had a really good response from people who've got into it, and they're seeing with their own eyes. They're seeing how water goes into their soil better. They're seeing how there are more worms in their soil. They're seeing more birds and mammals on the farm. So what benefit it is for you is dependent on what you're really looking for. But get a spade out, go and have a look before you start. See where you start from, what the soil looks like, what your worm counts are, etc. And then keep an eye on it over time, and you will see benefits. I'm absolutely convinced of that.
What do you think? A conversation on conservation. That's really hard. Conversation on conservation.